Before I introduce you to Professor Binu Mukherjee, I'd like him to come and please take his seat here. Professor Mukherjee is basically a scientist. In fact, basically he's a man of spirit, and he happened to be a scientist because love for Sri Aurobindo in him grew from his family tradition. Perhaps his parents were inspired by Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Sri Aurobindo, he lived in Aurobindo ashram in Pondicherry, now called Puducherry, since 1946. At the age of 6, he was there and started soaking that philosophy, which became his heart now. He pursued science and he did his BSc from Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education in India in 1960. Then he came to UK and he did BSc Honours in Physics from the University of St Andrews in Scotland in 1965. His PhD thesis was in superconductivity in physics from University of St Andrews, Scotland in 1971. He was a DRB Research Associate in Physics at the Royal Military College of Canada from 1969 to 76, and was a visiting professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Chennai from 1982 to 83. He was connected with professor in the Royal Military College in Kingston, Canada, throughout his life and the later life. And he retired from there in 2007. And he passes his time between Toronto and Puducherry, the Aurobindo ashram. I myself have visited Aurobindo ashram, and you can imagine the peace there. There is no ritual, there is no worship. There reigns only peace and prayer, silent prayer people do. And you gain something when you go there. The samadhi of Sri Aurobindo is there. Aurobindo's room is there. It's open only one day in a year. You can see from outside. But they provide you very simple prasad, food. But everyone is quiet and peaceful and very serving. People believe in selfless service, and it's all voluntarily done, everything, and it's wonderful environment. Those who visit India, I will request them to, if they go not only to visit Belur Math in Kolkata, but also to Puducherry near Tamil Nadu. So Professor Mukherjee was a big scientist, though here today we are trying to see him as a person interested in spirituality. He was head of the Department of Physics in Royal Military College, and to his credit are the publication numbering 83 he published, and 167 citations are to his credit. Today, he offered me to give talk in two subjects on Aurobindo. One was the first phase of life, and the second was the yogi. So, but I think we will like to have both of them. So first today, I requested him to give on Sri Aurobindo, scholar, poet, revolutionary, and yogi. Next time, when we arrange the talk, we'll hear on Sri Aurobindo, the sadhaka and the siddha. So Aurobindo is so intimately connected with Ramakrishna Vivekananda, as you heard from the reading, how he was. And his wife was, I think, if I don't hear, was initiated by Holy Mother Sarada Devi. So I request now Sri Professor Binu Mukherjee to give his lecture. Our regular time is 40 minutes, but today I don't want to restrict him for 40 minutes only. We don't have Vidya Mandir also, so he can continue to 50 or even to 60 minutes. We'll be glad. Professor Binu Mukherjee.
Respected Swami Kripamananda, ladies and gentlemen, and a special hello to some of my friends from the local Aurobindo group who are here today. Thank you very much for your introduction. I begin by making my pranams to Sri Ramakrishna, to Swami Vivekananda, to Sri Sharpama, to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, and as always my efforts are laid at the feet of the Mother. I would like to apologize a bit today. We returned from Pondicherry just a couple of weeks ago, and the cold has brought on a bit of asthma, so if I have to cough occasionally, I hope not, but please excuse me. I've been asked today to speak to you about Sri Aurobindo in an introductory kind of way. This is no easy task, for a variety of reasons. Sri Aurobindo was a brilliant scholar, a master of English, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, and we shall see later that he learned several Indian languages. As a political and revolutionary leader, he it was that fought to make the independence of India the goal of the Congress Party, at a time when it was only seeking some small degree of self-government. As a poet and writer, his name was twice put forward for the Nobel Prize. And yet, his most important work was as a yogi, whose yoga was not directed at a personal salvation, but rather towards bringing down of the supramental consciousness which would represent the next stage in the evolution of the human being towards a final state of unity with the divine, here on earth. On the one hand, his integral yoga goes forward from the vision of the Vedic rishis and combines it with the methods of the tantrics, and on the other hand, it combines Eastern spirituality with Western science and gives spiritual meaning to Darwinian evolution as we know of it in science, even while paving the way for the next step in the evolutionary process. To cover all of this in about an hour is indeed a stiff challenge. I can only give the briefest of introductions and leave details for later. And there is one other difficulty. Since all of Sri Aurobindo's activities were really expressions of his spiritual consciousness, they cannot be really understood on the basis of the mind, as we are attempting to do today. He has himself said that his life was not, and I quote, on the surface for men to see. More generally, he has said, and I quote again, what truly mattered in the life of a spiritual man is not what he did or what he was to the view of men of his time, but what he was and did within. It is only that that gives any value to his outer life at all. And so we must, perforce, rely to the largest extent on what little he has written about himself. In fact, as an aside, when I was listening to the introduction that Swamiji gave me, I think it's true for all of us that what we are and what we do within is far more important than what we are and what we do without. With that, let me begin. Aurobindo Ackroyd Ghosh, as he was then known, was born on the 15th of August 1872 in Calcutta, the third of four brothers. His father, Dr. Krishnadhan Ghosh, was a doctor and surgeon who had studied in England and had returned to India as a confirmed Anglophile. He was a very popular civil surgeon of Khulna district in Bengal. His mother, Swarnalata Devi, was the daughter of Rishi Rajnarayan Bose, one of the founders of the Brahmo Samaj, about whom it has been said that he represented in himself the composite culture of his time, Vedantic, Islamic, and European. After Sri Aurobindo's birth, his mother began to have mental problems. And when he was 4, he and his 2 elder brothers were sent to the Loreto boarding school in Darjeeling. When he was 7, his father took him and his brothers to England and left them there for their education, with the ultimate object that they be brought up as Englishmen, and with the further desire that Sri Aurobindo would join the Indian civil service after finishing his education. Initially, he was taught at home by the family with whom they lived, while the elder brothers went to school. He then studied in St. Paul's School in London, and thereafter won a classical scholarship to King's College, Cambridge. He had learned French during his early days in England, and I can say as an aside here that he later met Oscar Browning. Some of you may know of him. Browning has said that in all his career in reviewing the entrance essays for the scholarship, nobody ever submitted anything as brilliant as Aurobindo essay. He had learned French during his early days in England. At school and college, he excelled in Latin and Greek, and he taught himself German and Italian so that he may read Goethe and Dante in the original. Although he passed the open competition for the ICS with flying colors, he deliberately refrained from appearing at the horse riding examination that was compulsory, and was therefore disqualified from joining the ICS. He obtained instead an appointment at the Baroda State Service from the Maharaja of Baroda, and returned to India in January of 1893. He was then 21. During the last year of his studies at Cambridge, Aurobindo had been introduced to Indian philosophy, and he took up an English translation of the Upanishads. He also joined other Indian students in London, amongst them Chittaranjan Das, in discussing the future of India. Even then he was convinced that India's destiny had to be worked out by Indians, and that the British would not or could not do much to satisfy India's political aspirations. Aurobindo spent 13 years in Baroda helping the Maharaja in various capacities and being a professor of English and then vice principal of the college there. He spent most of his free time in reading and writing, and during this period he perfected his knowledge of Bengali and then studied Sanskrit so as to read Vyasa, Kalidasa, Bhartrihari and others in the original, and he translated many of Kalidasa and Bhartrihari's works into English poetry. Sanskrit, of course, gave him access to the sacred writings of the Vedanta in the original. He also learned Bengali, Marathi, Gujarati and Hindi, and later he learned enough Tamil to be able to appreciate the saint poets who had written in Tamil. During this period of his life, Aurobindo's major preoccupation was the liberation of India from British rule. The Indian National Congress had been founded in 1985, mainly as an association of highly educated Indians, partly with the idea of acting as a safety valve to relieve discontent. In its first 20 years, it did little to promote India's freedom, with delegates at successive annual congresses proclaiming their loyalty to Britain in obsequious fashion. In 1893-94, at the age of 22, Aurobindo wrote a series of articles for the Hindu Prakash of Bombay called New Lamps for Old, in which he severely castigated the then Congress leadership and vigorously advocated the complete independence of India. While they created a temporary sensation, the owner of the paper became worried about the possibility of being prosecuted for sedition, and Aurobindo stopped his series soon thereafter. He also found little response in the Congress, and returned instead to his studies and his spiritual pursuits, at the time primarily in the belief that he needed spiritual power to accomplish the goal of Indian independence. The Indian national movement had two sides, an open political agitation and a secret revolutionary activity. Aurobindo was a pioneer in both, although he mostly preferred to work behind the scenes. In 1906, Aurobindo resigned from the Baroda service and returned to Calcutta to become the founding principal of the Bengal National College and plunge headlong into the political struggle. I do not have time here to go into the details of his political career, but it is worth recalling that Aurobindo, working with Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai and Bipin Chandra Pal, was largely instrumental in awakening India from its torpor and its slavish mentality, and in establishing the pursuit of India's freedom as the permanent goal for Indian polity in general and the Indian National Congress in particular. And this, well before Gandhiji, Pandit Nehru and Netaji arrived on the political scene. Aurobindo was accused of sedition or treason 3 times, but he was acquitted on every occasion due to a lack of evidence. During the last of these occasions, Aurobindo was detained for 12 months in the Alipur jail in Calcutta during 1908-1909, While in jail, he did intense sadhana that resulted in very profound spiritual experiences to which I shall refer later. After his release, Sri Aurobindo continued to work as a leader of the extremist wing of the Congress Party, as well as on his personal sadhana. He established 2 newspapers, as you have just heard, Karma Yogin in English and Dharma in Bengali, with the object of uniting the 2 main streams of Indian national life, religion and politics, into, and I quote, one mighty, invincible and grandiose flood, end of quote, as in ancient India, when, and I quote again, the life of the nation flowed in a broad and single stream, end of quote. Sri Aurobindo wrote most of the articles in both newspapers, in addition to functioning as the extremist chief public spokesman, policymaker and negotiator. However, in January of 1910, revolutionaries associated with Sri Aurobindo assassinated a police official in the Calcutta High Court, and word reached Sri Aurobindo in early February that he would be arrested the following day. As usual at this time, Sri Aurobindo sought divine guidance and received a sudden command, or an adesh as we know it in India, to go to Chandernagore in French India. He did so at once. Within a month, he had received another command telling him to go to Pondicherry. On 4th of April of that year, he arrived in Pondicherry with a small number of close associates, and once there, he gave his spiritual life his full attention. He did this on the strength of a divine assurance that he received that the independence of India had become a certainty and would occur on his birthday. Let us now turn to Sri Aurobindo's spiritual life. Sri Aurobindo had begun to take an interest in Vedanta even during his stay in England. However, the dominant interpretation of the Vedanta, Shankaracharya's Mayavada, was that the absolute reality of Brahman was true, whereas the world was a lie. And this rather put Sri Aurobindo off. When he returned to India and stepped on Indian soil at Bombay, a vast calm and quiet descended on him and remained with him for several months thereafter. He said later that it was this experience of the calm and silent self, that it was the experience of the calm and silent self, a realization that is normally attained by yogis after years of sadhana. At the time, Sri Aurobindo knew nothing about yoga, nor did he have any interest in it. It was as if Mother India was welcoming her son back by giving him, unasked, a glimpse of her spiritual treasures. Later in Baroda, Sri Aurobindo continued his study of the Upanishads and the Gita and became convinced that Shankara's interpretation was not in accord with the texts. They did not insist on the unreality of the world, nor did they demand inaction. Once Sri Aurobindo knew that he did not have to renounce life to take up sadhana, he commenced his practice of yoga in 1904. Sri Aurobindo has written of 4 great realizations on which his yoga and his spiritual philosophy are founded. I should perhaps first explain the meaning of spiritual experiences and realizations. Sri Aurobindo explains, and I quote, "Experience is a word that covers almost all happenings in yoga. That is, becoming aware of the divine peace, presence, force, bliss, etc. Realization is when such experiences, instead of coming as flashes, snatches or rare visitations, become very positive or frequent or continuous or normal, and the thing realized becomes more real, more dynamic, more intimately present to the consciousness than any physical thing can be." The first of Sri Aurobindo's great realizations occurred in Baroda towards the end of 1907, when he met with the Maratha yogi Vishnu Bhaskar Lele. Lele suggested that they retire to a secluded place for a few days, and Sri Aurobindo has described his experience as follows. I quote, "Sit in meditation," Lele said, "but do not think. Look only at your mind. You will see thoughts coming into it. Before they can enter, throw them away from your mind till your mind is capable of entire silence. I had never heard before of thoughts coming visibly into the mind from outside, but I did not think either of questioning the truth or the possibility. I simply sat down and did it. In a moment, my mind had become silent as the windless air on a high mountain summit. And then I saw one thought and then another coming in a concrete way from outside. I flung them away before they could enter and take hold of the brain, and in 3 days I was free. End of quote. His sense of self was replaced by, and I quote, a concrete consciousness of stillness and silence from which arose an awareness of some soul and supreme reality. End of quote. Which he later identified, and I quote again, as the passive Brahman. End of quote. Sri Aurobindo states, and I quote again, this experience was attended first by an overwhelming feeling and perception of the total unreality of the world, Thus, Sri Aurobindo had had the experience that was the basis of Mayavada philosophy. However, he lived in the awareness of the supreme reality before, and I quote, it began to admit other things into itself, and realization added itself to realization. End of quote. And so, Sri Aurobindo came to realize that the beings and objects of the world were not, I quote, separate things as they appear, end of quote, but rather, quote again, real images or manifestations of the one reality or Brahman, end of quote. He now saw the world as, and I quote, the self-manifestation of the Shakti or the creative energy of the Supreme. And thus he left behind the Mayavada philosophy. In 1908, Sri Aurobindo sought further guidance from Levi, who told him that if Sri Aurobindo could implicitly follow his inner guide, he would have no further need of a human guru. Sri Aurobindo accepted this advice, and from that point on, surrender to the divine became the principle of his life and of his yoga. Sri Aurobindo's second great realization occurred during his sadhana in Alipur jail. He was given a copy of the Gita, and on reading it, he was able, and I quote, not only to understand intellectually, but to realize what Sri Krishna demanded of Arjuna and what he demands of those who aspire to do his work, to renounce self-will and become a passive and faithful instrument in his hands. End of quote. This was followed by an all-encompassing awareness of Lord Krishna as Vasudeva. Lord Krishna, he says, my friend and lover. With this, this was followed by, I skipped something. This was followed by an all-encompassing awareness of Lord Krishna as Vasudeva all around him. The cell walls and bars, the tree in front of the cell, the warders of the cell and the magistrate, they all appeared to him to be Vasudeva, Lord Krishna. I quote, my friend and lover, as he called him. With this, Sri Aurobindo's individual awareness broadened into what he called, I quote again, the cosmic consciousness. During his sadhana in Alipur jail, Sri Aurobindo received help from Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. He has written, and I quote, Swami Vivekananda visited me for 15 days in Alipur jail, and until I could grasp the whole thing, he went on teaching me and impressed on my mind the working of the higher consciousness. He would not leave me until he had put it all into my head. End of quote. We note that Swami Vivekananda had left his body over 6 years earlier. The realization of the passive Brahman and the dissolution of the self in the cosmic consciousness have usually been regarded as the final goal of yoga. To Sri Aurobindo, they were important. They were very important, but hardly sufficient. He had first started yoga with the idea of obtaining spiritual help in the political quest for Indian independence. Now he clearly wished to achieve more for the world. In his own words, his object was, and I quote again, not an individual achievement of divine realization for the sake of the individual, but something to be gained for the earth consciousness. And again, I quote, I'm concerned with the earth, not with worlds far beyond for their own sake. It is a terrestrial realization that I seek, and not a flight to distant summits. Over the next decades, he attempted to hew out a road in largely uncharted regions. Our yoga, he has said, and I quote, is not a retreading of old walks, but a spiritual adventure. End of quote. Sri Aurobindo's realization of life as an expression of the divine reality enabled him to find new meaning in the tantric approach. Mukti, or union with the one reality, was only one of the objectives of Tantra. Another was the enjoyment of the phenomenal creation of the world as a manifestation of the divine Shakti. This brought Sri Aurobindo to formulating a path which, in his words, I quote, starts from the method of the Vedanta to arrive at the aim of the Tantra. End of quote. He realized that the divine Shakti was itself available to aid the process of spiritual development. This realization was of immense importance in relation to Sri Aurobindo's advice to his disciples about how to proceed, as we shall see. At this point, we need to talk about planes of consciousness. The Indian spiritual tradition distinguished 6 planes, divided into the lower hemisphere and the higher hemisphere. The lower hemisphere had the 3 planes with which we are familiar. There is matter, which is how the universe started. There is life, into which the life consciousness brought us. Then there was the mental consciousness which came and brought forth the mind as we know it today. The higher hemisphere had the planes of pure existence, pure consciousness, and pure bliss. These in India are commonly known as Sat, Chit, and Anand, which together comprise the absolute reality. So that is on top, and I've said what's at the bottom. However, Sri Aurobindo discovered that between the upper and lower hemispheres, there is a 7th plane, a link plane, which he called initially the truth consciousness and later the supramental consciousness. Please note that by this he does not denote a higher activity of the mind. It is a different power altogether, as different from mind as mind is from life and life is from matter. About the supermind, Sri Aurobindo has written, and I quote, supramental consciousness is the divine consciousness come down. Supermind is the faculty that we have to develop. He has written, and I quote, what I received about the supermind was a direct, not a derived knowledge given to me. It was only afterwards that I found certain confirmatory revelations in the Upanishads and the Vedas. As Sri Aurobindo continued his personal sadhana, he became aware that between the supermind and the lower planes, there was an intermediate plane, which he described as the supraconscient cosmic mind, and to which he gave the name of overmind. He described the overmind, and I quote, as the ultimate source of man's higher intuitions and the determining source of all movements below it and of all mental energies. End of quote. While it served to link the lower mind-life-body consciousnesses with the supramental consciousness above, it was, said Sri Aurobindo, a brilliant golden lid that veiled the face of the greater truth. So it was at once a passage and an obstacle. And it took Sri Aurobindo many years to negotiate that obstacle without losing the passage. And finally, on the 24th of November in 1926, he was able to complete the descent of the overmind into his physical consciousness. And this day has since been celebrated as the day when he attained siddhi, or perfection. This then was Sri Aurobindo's third great realization. Continuing his sadhana, Sri Aurobindo further realized that there are two simultaneous processes that contributed to spiritual development. The process of one's ascent into the higher planes and the process of receiving the descent of their powers into one's consciousness. So it was a twofold process, one ascent and a descent. The discovery of this dual process, and in particular of the ability to use the energies of the higher consciousness to further spiritually develop our lower consciousnesses, that constituted Sri Aurobindo's fourth great realization. Sri Aurobindo has written less about his sadhana after the descent of the overmind. He did keep a record of sadhana, which is very hard to decipher. This was published after he passed away. He went into seclusion soon afterwards, but it can be gathered from this that his spiritual preoccupations were along two lines. One was the effort to bring the supramental light and power into the overmind, and it was primarily to accomplish this without hindrance that he chose to go into seclusion. He has said, and I quote, "I know with absolute certitude that the supramental is a truth, and that its advent is in the very nature of things inevitable." End of quote. His efforts were directed towards the transformation of the physical and material consciousness. This was undoubtedly the most difficult and incomplete of his goals. But although incomplete, he felt that whatever he could accomplish would help towards the eventual establishment of a divine life on earth, rather than in some ethereal heaven. And he has said, and I quote, "A divine life in a divine body is the formula of the ideal that we envisage." Or again, in poetic form, he has written, "Nature shall live to manifest secret God. The spirit shall take up the human plane. This earthly life become the life divine." Apart from his early interaction with Lele, Sri Aurobindo had conducted his sadhana on his own. When he first went to Pondicherry, a small group of 4 went with him as disciples. Sri Aurobindo taught them Greek, Latin, and French, and encouraged their literary efforts, but his sadhana was largely his own. Although a few other members were added to this group, the situation was largely unchanged until the arrival of the mother in 1920. Born Mira Alfasa on 21st February 1878 in Paris, she was an accomplished painter and musician who had psychic and spiritual experiences from an early age. In her occult experiences, she was visited by and helped by a few personalities. Amongst these was a dark-skinned personality that she knew as Lord Krishna. In 1914, she accompanied her husband to Pondicherry and recognized Sri Aurobindo as the teacher who had occultly been guiding her spiritual development. She helped him start a philosophical review, the Arya, in which most of his major writings appeared between 1914 and 1921. The mother spent the years of the First World War back in France and Japan and returned to Pondicherry on 24th of April in 1920, when she resumed her collaboration with Sri Aurobindo. It was Sri Aurobindo who called her the mother, and she in turn who first added the appellation Shri to Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo has described his personal force as representing the Purusha element, acting principally in the realm of spiritual knowledge, and the mother's force as representing the divine and creative Shakti. The mother was an individual manifestation of the divine. As Sri Aurobindo puts it, and I quote, "The divine puts on an appearance of humanity, assumes the outward human nature in order to tread the path and show it to human beings, but does not cease to be the divine. It is a manifestation that takes place, a manifestation of growing divine consciousness, not human turning into divine. The mother was inwardly above the human, even in childhood." End of quote. And again, I quote, "The mother's consciousness and mine are the same," he said, "the one divine consciousness in two." End of quote. Sri Aurobindo had no interest in being a guru. he felt that the Guru-Shishya relationship had lost its potency by being conventionalized. In a letter to his brother Barin in 1920, he wrote, and I quote, "What I want is for someone awakened by my touch or by that of another to manifest from within his sleeping divinity and to realize the divine life." End of quote. The growth of a group of disciples happened naturally and spontaneously and resulted in the formation of the Sri Aurobindo ashram, and the community of sadhaks provided a field of experimentation where Sri Aurobindo and the mother could know how their force acted on ordinary men and women. Sri Aurobindo's own spiritual progress had been through the mind. It was through the silent mind that he had realized the Brahman, and it was through the higher levels of the mind that he was approaching the supermind. Initially, Sri Aurobindo assumed that his companions would follow a similar route. However, the ordinary mind operates through analysis, that is, division, arrangement, organization. Truth can only be grasped by a synthetic vision. It is not easy to establish reliable contact with the higher levels of mind that we call intuition or genius, and we often confuse lower impulses with them. From 1926 onwards, Sri Aurobindo changed focus, telling his disciples to follow the promptings of their soul by seeking out their psychic being and bringing it forward. When this happens, he has written, and I quote, "There is an automatic perception of what is true and untrue, what is divine and undivine." Incidentally, by psychic being, Sri Aurobindo means the soul or the seat of the divine in us. In order to be able to do this, Sri Aurobindo asks sadhaks to open themselves to the mother's force and to surrender completely to its workings. Eventually, the whole being would be transformed in the mold of the psychic, and then the more difficult spiritual and supramental transformations could proceed more smoothly. Between 1920 and 1926, the number of Sri Aurobindo's disciples grew from about half a dozen to around 20. After his retirement into seclusion following the overmental descent in 1926, he told his disciples that the mother would look after their development. From that point on, the ashram grew rapidly to 85 in 2 years, to 150 in a few more, and today there are about 2,000 permanent residents, apart from innumerable disciples who live around the world. Sri Aurobindo was very diffident about the use of the word ashram, since this institution is quite different from other traditional ashrams. In the light of Sri Aurobindo's realizations, this ashram has not been created for the renunciation of the world. Here, as Swamiji has said, there are no sannyasis, no bare-bodied bhaktas or saffron-colored sadhus, no murtis, no kirtans, no bhajans, no artis. But there are all the kinds of human activity known to man: industries, agriculture, education, sports, culture, etc. Sri Aurobindo does not emphasize sit-down meditation. To him, and I quote, "all life is yoga, and all the activities become a meditation if carried out as an egoless offering to the mother." On the other hand, he emphasizes the importance of concentration or single-minded effort. Sri Aurobindo has said, and I quote, "My aim is to create a center of spiritual life which will serve as a means of bringing down the higher consciousness and making it a power not merely for salvation, but for a divine life on earth." End of quote. The mother has been the active director of the ashram's inner and outer life. The importance of her in Sri Aurobindo's yoga can hardly be exaggerated. In his voluminous correspondence with his disciples, time and again he asked them to surrender completely to the mother and to open themselves to her force as the simplest way to spiritual progress. He has characterized in detail the mother's work under her various aspects, principally as Maheshwari, Mahakali, Mahalakshmi, and Mahasaraswati. But his interpretations of these aspects is quite different from that of traditional Indian mythology. Let me next turn briefly to Sri Aurobindo's writings, for he was well known as a writer and a poet too. These can almost all be described as philosophical writings. Sri Aurobindo has always said that he was not a philosopher, but had been forced to write philosophy. When the mother first came to Pondicherry, along with her husband, they suggested to Sri Aurobindo that they jointly edit a journal of philosophy called Arya. Unfortunately, both of them had to leave Pondicherry in early 1915, and Sri Aurobindo was left holding the fort alone and continued to write voluminously for the Arya for the next 7 years or so. Talking of the philosophy, of his philosophy that he was going to expound, he has written, I quote, "Spirit being the fundamental truth of existence, life can only be its manifestation. Spirit must be not only the origin of life, but its basis, its pervading reality, and its highest and total result. But the forms of life, as they appear to us, are at once its disguises and its instruments of self-manifestation. Man has to grow in knowledge till they cease to be disguises and grow in spiritual power and quality till they become in him its perfect instruments. To grow into the fullness of the divine is the true law of human life, and to shape his earthly existence into its image is the meaning of its evolution." To elaborate on this, Sri Aurobindo started writing a series of articles which ran in parallel and which have since been published as books. I'm going to, in his own words, describe what these were, but remember that when he was first writing them in a magazine or in a journal, he was writing them all in parallel. The first of these, later published as The Life Divine, he worked out the above truth which I've just read out from a metaphysical point of view, and showed that it was not inconsistent with the Vedas, the Vedanta, the Upanishads, and the Gita. But, and I quote now, "The truth of spirit is of only theoretical value, unless it can be lived, and we have therefore tried, in another series that is published as the Synthesis of Yoga, to arrive at a synthetical view of the principles and methods of the various lines of spiritual discipline, and the way in which they can lead to an integral divine life in the human existence. But this is an individual self-development, and therefore it was necessary for us to show how our ideal can work out in the social life of mankind. This resulted in the book The Psychology of Social Development, later published as The Human Cycle, where we have in this we have indicated how these truths affect the evolution of human society. In another series that was published as The Ideal of Human Unity, we have taken the present trend of mankind towards a closer unification and tried to appreciate its tendencies and show what is wanting in them in order that real human unity may be achieved." End of quote. In his later years, Sri Aurobindo had started another series in which he discussed the foundations and mainsprings of Indian culture and civilization in a series of articles that have been published as the Foundations of Indian Culture. I should tell you that those who served Sri Aurobindo in close quarters at this time, they have said that he hardly thought when he wrote. He put his paper down, he picked up his pen, and he wrote continuously. Occasionally he would get up to wipe the sweat off himself. Otherwise, there was no thinking, no scratching out, no coming back. Sri Aurobindo did not write from his mind. He was writing down what he received from above. But when asked, Sri Aurobindo always said that he was a poet. He always wanted to be a poet. All else that he did or became was either by accident or by adesh. His first public volume was a collection of poetry. His last published book, on which he worked for more than 30 years, was an epic poem, Savitri. In between, he brought out 9 volumes of verse and left enough unpublished for several more volumes. He gave a special value to poetry because he considered poetry superior to prose as a means of expressing spiritual experience. Poetry, by making fuller use of the resources of language, is better able to communicate mystic experiences than the more precise but less suggestive idiom of prose. In his book, The Future Poetry, Sri Aurobindo worked out a literary theory based on this premise, and in his poems he put this theory into practice. Sri Aurobindo wrote in all the 4 major poetic forms: lyric, dramatic, narrative, and epic. He was a master of English meter and rhythm. He suggested that poetry could be graded in 2 different ways, according to the source of its inspiration, or according to the degree of its rhythmic and verbal perfection. The highest poetry, he said, came from the overmental inspiration or from some high plane of intuition. Sri Aurobindo called this supreme poetry mantra, because he felt that the most perfect examples of it in word literature were the mantras of the Vedas, and he made a conscious effort to bring the power of the mantra into English poetry. Sri Aurobindo greatly admired the epics of classical Greece, and he looked on Homer's use of dactylic hexameter as perhaps the most perfect metrical instrument ever devised. In 1910, when in jail, he started his epic poem Ilion, a poetic recreation of the last day of the Trojan War, as an attempt to solve the problem of the hexameter in English. Over the next 3 years, he completed 8 chapters, and these were later published after revision. But in 1915, he began another epic, Savitri, which started as the story of Savitri and Satyavan from Indian mythology. This started as a straightforward tale of love conquering death, but as he revised and re-revised his poem, he brought out more of the story's symbolic possibilities. Eventually, it became a poetic chronicle of his yoga, equal in importance to his books The Life Divine and The Synthesis of Yoga. Moreover, it was not only a record of his sadhana, but part of it. He wrote, I quote, "I used Savitri as a means of ascension." End of quote. And again, I quote, "Savitri has not been regarded by me as a poem to be written and finished, but as a field of experimentation to see how far poetry can be written from one's own yogic consciousness and how that could be made creative." In Sri Aurobindo's story, Savitri, granted as a boon to the childless sage Aswapati, is an incarnation of the Divine Mother. Aswapati is regarded as a yogin aspiring for a universal realization and a new creation, like Sri Aurobindo himself. Sri Aurobindo's description of the realms through which Aswapati must pass has been described by one biographer as, and I quote, "the most detailed account of the geography of the inner worlds." End of quote. And again, I quote, "He meant it as a rhythmical embodiment of his experiences that could awake sympathetic vibrations in those who read it." Savitri is an epic poem of nearly 24,000 lines. It's a fat book like that. I only have time here to give you a small example. Sri Aurobindo starts Savitri with a description of the symbolic dawn. It was the hour before the gods awake. Across the path of the divine event, the huge foreboding of mind of night, alone in her unlit temple of eternity, lay stretched, immobile upon silence's marge. An unshaped consciousness desired light, and a blank prescience yearned towards distant change. As if a childlike finger laid on a cheek, reminded of the endless need in things, the heedless mother of the universe, an infant, longing, clutched the somber last. Insensibly, somewhere a breach began. A long, lone line of hesitating hue, like a vague smile tempting a desert heart, troubled the far rim of life's obscure sleep. The darkness failed and slipped like a falling cloak from the reclining body of a god. Then, through the pallid rift that seemed at first hardly enough for a trickle from the suns, outpoured the revelation and the flame. Following his, I should say, by the way, that I have a personal feeling that I once brought out with a professor of English. Having read Sri Aurobindo, I'm not aware of any writer in the English language, and I've read quite a bit, who has used a larger percentage of the words in the Oxford Dictionary than has Sri Aurobindo. One of the professors suggested to me that Shakespeare had probably come close. Following his over-mental descent, Sri Aurobindo went into seclusion and only gave darshan to the general public 3 or 4 times a year. As his fame as a yogi and a philosopher spread, more and more people came for the darshans. But even in isolation, Sri Aurobindo never withdrew from contact with the real world. Writing in the third person, Sri Aurobindo has said, and I quote, "In his retirement, Sri Aurobindo kept a close watch on all that was happening in the world and in India, and actively intervened whenever necessary, but solely with the spiritual force and silent spiritual action." I'll just give you a couple of short examples here before I proceed. A prime example of this, and this was also an exception to his rule that he only did things quietly. A prime example of this was during the Second World War. Sri Aurobindo saw very clearly that Hitler and his friends were a manifestation of Asuric forces of evil, and in 1940 he broke his silence and publicly announced his support of Britain and France, and he sent a message to the Congress Party in India asking that they publicly support the British war effort. He saw the winning of the war as a far greater moment to the world and to India than India's struggle for freedom. If Germany and Japan had won, he foresaw not liberation, but a harsher servitude for India and the world. Indeed, throughout the war, Mother and Sri Aurobindo were active in the spiritual planes in support of the Allied cause. The mother said later that the Ashura's aim of the war was precisely to bring Sri Aurobindo and the mother's yogic realization to a halt. Again, in 1942, when the British cabinet sent Sir Stafford Cripps to India with a promise for dominion status after the war, in exchange for cooperation in the Allied war effort, Sri Aurobindo saw this as a means to combine the national and global requirements. He saw acceptance as a means of defending the country and later of organizing her freedom and unity. He sent a personal emissary to the Congress Working Committee, requesting them to accept the offer. But except for C. Rajagopalachari, no member of the committee agreed with Sri Aurobindo. Consequently, the Cripps offer was rejected. Mother said at the time, and I quote, "Nothing on earth created by man is flawless, because the human mind has a limited capacity. Yet, behind this offer by Cripps is the divine grace directly present. The grace is now at the door of India, ready to give its help, but if it is rejected, the grace will withdraw, and then the nation will suffer terribly." As we know now, and that's the end of the quotation, as we know now, the rejection of the Cripps offer by the then leaders of the Indian National Congress resulted later in the partition of India and its disastrous consequences. Writing in the aftermath of the Cripps mission, Sri Aurobindo, referring to himself in the third person, again wrote, "When negotiations failed with Sir Stafford Cripps, Sri Aurobindo returned to his reliance on the use of spiritual force alone against the aggressor, and had the satisfaction of seeing the tide of Japanese victory, which had till then swept everything before it, change immediately into a tide of rapid crushing and finally immense and overwhelming Allied victory." Maggie Lichi Grassi has written a whole book on Sri Aurobindo and the mother's personal interventions during the war. A couple of examples will have to suffice here as quick ones. Some of you will be aware that during the time that Hitler's troops were rampant in Europe, Winston Churchill used to deliver stirring broadcast speeches to help the British keep up their morale. In fact, it has been said that Churchill turned the English language into an instrument of war. The mother had told Maggie that Sri Aurobindo used to tell her about the words that he would put into Churchill's mind while he composed the speeches, and certain passages spoken by Churchill were word for word. At the time, speaking about Churchill, Mother said, and I quote, "He is being guided by the divine directly, and his soul is responding magnificently." And those of you who have read Churchill's war memoirs will know that he often acknowledged the help he received from, and I quote, "his maker with a capital M." It is a personal regret of mine that most of us Indians have been misled by Churchill's opposition to Indian freedom from appreciating his real greatness. There are a large number of fields in which he excelled, and I would certainly recommend you to them sometime. One other example of Sri Aurobindo's action during the war, on 19th March of 1944, 230,000 Japanese troops, aided by 3,000 men of Subhash Bose's Indian National Army, crossed from Burma into India, and it was generally expected that Imphal would fall imminently, in spite of dogged resistance by British and Indian troops loyal to the crown. Then, incessant rains came down, and the skies opened, and the Japanese chance of success was washed away. When this was reported to Sri Aurobindo, he smiled. I go on from this. There are a lot of other ways in which they worked at that time. In 1943, Sir Francis Younghusband, who reviewed Sri Aurobindo's book, The Life Divine, in the Times Literary Review, and Aldous Huxley, one of the preeminent intellectuals of the time, proposed Sri Aurobindo for the Nobel Prize in Literature, but in the middle of the war, no prize was given that year. In 1950, two Nobel laureates, Gabriela Mistral and Pearl Buck, again moved and seconded a formal nomination to the Swedish Academy for the Nobel Prize in Literature to be awarded to Sri Aurobindo. However, Sri Aurobindo passed away that year. Indeed, from the late 1940s, Sri Aurobindo had suffered off and on from signs of an enlargement of the prostate. In 1950, the ailment returned with force, resulting in kidney infection leading to uremia. Sri Aurobindo declined to receive any major treatment from the physicians in attendance, or even to use his own spiritual powers on himself. When asked, he said simply, "I cannot explain, you won't understand." He fell into a strange kind of coma from which he seemed to emerge at will. But sometime after midnight on 5th December of 1950, he entered into a coma for the last time, and at 1:26 a.m. his vital functions ceased. No signs of physical decay were observed for 4 days, and it was not until the 9th that the supramental aura which had kept his body from decay gradually withdrew. That evening, Sri Aurobindo's mortal remains were interred in the Samadhi below the service tree so fondly nurtured by the mother since 1930. On the 14th of December, Mother said, and I quote, "To grieve is an insult to Sri Aurobindo, who is here with us, conscious and alive. In later years, she time and again referred to his concrete presence and the enormous work that he was doing behind the scenes to hasten the manifestation of the supramental. And on the 29th of January 1956, Mother announced the descent of the supramental consciousness into the Earth's consciousness. It has been said that 4 people scattered around the world were aware that some epochal event had occurred, even if they were not precisely aware of the true significance. On the 24th of April 1956, Mother has declared, I quote, "The manifestation of the supramental upon earth is no more a promise, but a living fact. It is at work here, and one day will come when the most blind, the most unconscious, even the most unwilling shall be obliged to recognize it." End of quote. When a child asked the mother what a new race is, she replied, I quote, "Wait. Let us say some thousands of years, and you will see it. When the mind descended upon earth, that is, when the mental consciousness descended upon earth, between the time the mind manifested in the earth atmosphere and the first human being appeared, nearly 1 million years elapsed. Now it will go faster because man expects it. But faster still means thousands of years probably. We shall talk about it after some thousands of years. I shall conclude now by reading Mother's message, which has been inscribed on Sri Aurobindo's Samadhi. To thee, who hast been the material envelope of our Master, to thee our infinite gratitude. Before thee, who hast done so much for us, who hast worked, struggled, suffered, hoped, endured so much. Before thee, who hast willed all, attempted all, prepared, achieved all for us. Before thee we bow down and implore that we may never forget, even for a moment, all we owe to thee. Thank you very much.